He crushed empires while fighting shoulder to shoulder with his men, never losing a single battle. He excelled in every form of warfare, inventing new siege tactics, commanding vast army formations on the battlefield, as well as mastering the skill of deception to psych out his enemies before the fighting even began. He advanced further into the unseen world than anyone else before him, establishing one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. And what's even more impressive is that he achieved it all in less than a decade. But how was he able to do all of this? In this video we will look at 3 legendary tactical maneuvers by Alexander that reveals what made him supreme in all fields of warfare. After having defeated Darius III at Issus a year prior, Alexander was left with 2 choices: to either pursue the fleeing army of Darius into mainland Persia, or to swing south and knock out the various Persian naval bases along the coastline of the Levant. Alexander chose the latter option and started marching his army down the coastline. And one by one, the coastal bases surrendered without a fight when they saw the overwhelming force of the new king approach them. Except for one. The powerful naval base of Tyre refused to submit to Alexander, and not without reason. Tyre was an island 800 meters off the coast and had walls up to 50 meters high. They could not be starved out for decades, and its navy and archers were some of the best in the world. Even with a stronger navy, it was deemed impossible to conquer. And this was proven, for example, in the 6th century BC, when the island fortress withstood a siege from the king of Babylon for over 13 years, until a truce was finally made. But Alexander was different, and his solution was legendary. If the sea stood in his way, he would simply remove it. He ordered his engineers to dismantle the city of Old Tyre on the mainland and use the debris to begin constructing a massive causeway out towards the fortress. Under constant harassment from Tyrian archers and ships, Alexander's engineers advanced the causeway slowly but with an unbreakable resolve, with Macedonian siege engines hurling projectiles back at the defenders. But the elite Tyrian navy had many tricks up their sleeves, and responded with sending ships loaded with dry wood and sulfur towards the siege towers. And as the fire took hold, the Tyrian marines attacked as well, killing many of Alexander's engineers, and made sure that both of the enormous siege towers were burned to the ground. It was a major setback for Alexander, one that might have broken a lesser commander, and the Tyrians hoped that this would make him call off the siege entirely. But Alexander refused to back down, ordering the causeway to be built even wider and with bigger siege towers. In addition, he called in his own navy from across the empire to establish a complete naval dominance. And this new protection from the Macedonian navy allowed the causeway to finally connect to the fortress, and for the catapults to begin breaking down the walls. However, Alexander knew that a full-scale attack through the heavily defended narrow choke point would result in bloodshed beyond comprehension, with a Pyrrhic victory at best, and the destruction of his own army at worst. He needed another breach point in the wall for a 2-pronged attack, and proceeded to fit his ships with catapults, ordering them to break down the walls south of the fortress. And after a few days of concentrated bombardment, the Macedonian navy reported to Alexander that a second breach had been made. Alexander then quickly ordered around 30% of his army into transport galleys, and coordinated the attack on the southern side of the wall together with the main attack over the causeway. Alexander then ordered a full attack. The pressure on both sides began mounting significantly, and with most of the Tyrian elite troops busy defending the main breach, the defense quickly crumbled on the southern side of the wall. Fighting erupted throughout the city as resistance collapsed, and after months of anger and resentment built up among the Macedonian troops, a brutal massacre and a general destruction of the city pursued. Tyre was utterly destroyed, with 2,000 of the surviving defenders crucified on the beaches, and the remaining population sold into slavery. In a mere 7 months, Alexander had done what a previous Babylonian emperor could not do in 13 years. And the causeway that he built would forever change the coastline, turning Tyre from an island into a peninsula that is still there to this very day. About a year later, with the Levant and its naval bases firmly in the grip of the Macedonian Empire, Alexander finally turned east to confront the Persian king Darius III and end his reign once and for all. While Alexander had been busy conquering the Levant, Darius had spent his time assembling a vast army drawn from every corner of his empire and prepared for a decisive final confrontation with Alexander. Once Darius got word that Alexander's army started crossing the Tigris River, he moved his army from Babylon up to the field of Gaugamela and awaited the arrival of the Macedonian army. Darius chose the field of Gaugamela largely because of what he had learned from his defeat at Issus a few years prior, where his army had found itself trapped between the mountains and the sea in a narrow choke point. Gaugamela, on the other hand, was a completely flat field, a perfect choice for his Shittite chariots and the rest of his giant army that he had now gathered. On the flip side, Darius allowed the Macedonian army to take camp in the hills surrounding the field, which gave Alexander complete vision over the Persian army, while the Persians had no idea what the Macedonians were up to, which had a strong psychological effect. And because Alexander had a reputation of sudden and aggressive maneuvers, Darius fully expected a night attack, and ordered his army to remain awake and fully armed throughout the night. But Alexander knew that he was in complete control, and intentionally did nothing. Instead, he made sure that his own army got a full night of good sleep and was well fed before the battle. Early on the next day, the well-rested Macedonian army started appearing on the field in front of the rather fatigued 100,000 strong Persian army. The layout of the Persian army consisted of around 70,000 regular infantry in the center, with around 30,000 cavalry split in 2 groups on each flank, and 200 chariots in the front. And on such a flat terrain, this posed a serious threat to Alexander's mostly infantry-based army of 40,000 infantry and a mere 7,000 cavalry. And even though Alexander's army was better trained, rested, and disciplined, this could easily result in a catastrophic defeat if he allowed the massive Persian cavalry forces to break his flanks. Alexander knew he couldn't let Darius control the battle, and decided to quickly make the first move. He swung his cavalry far out to the right, which eventually forced the Persian counterpart to follow suit. But Darius wanted to keep his army centered as much as possible, and as the Persian line grew thinner, Darius ordered the cavalry to attack, exactly as Alexander had hoped to provoke. And while the cavalry forces were fighting each other on the right, Darius sent in the chariots directly against the Macedonian center and right. But the phalanxes were well trained for this sort of maneuver, and parted ranks at the last moment, letting the chariots pass through before attacking them from the rear. Soon after the failed chariot attack, Darius sent in the remaining massive cavalry force directly against the Macedonian left flank, hoping for a swift breakthrough. But despite being heavily outnumbered, the Macedonian left held out stubbornly. Now seeing how the Persian cavalry got bogged down on the left as well, Darius sent in the bulk of his infantry against the Macedonian center. This, however, was exactly the moment Alexander had waited for, because there would now be a massive gap between the Macedonian center and left flank, which could be used as a runway to mount an attack directly against Darius himself. Alexander's cavalry unit, together with a handful of infantry, broke out of the fighting and stormed against Darius. A furious clash followed between Alexander's units and the Persian royal guard, but before long, Darius once again fled the battlefield. Alexander chose not to pursue Darius further because the Macedonian left was at this point under relentless pressure from the overwhelming Persian cavalry force and needed desperate help, which made Alexander and his units turn back to relieve them. But now, seeing Alexander and his units behind them, and Darius nowhere in sight, the Persian center began to waver as panic spread through the ranks. and eventually the entire army fell into a full rout. The Persian army was shattered, and although Darius had managed to escape, he was soon killed by his own generals. Alexander's main obstacle to crushing the Persian Empire had finally been overcome. After toppling Darius III and the Persian Empire, Alexander pushed even deeper into the unknown, and over the next 5 years, his army marched through the heart of Asia, crossing deserts, mountain ranges, and river valleys no Macedonian had ever seen before. And by 326 BC, he had reached the frontiers of India, where he encountered a new and formidable enemy, King Porus, who was a ruler of a wealthy kingdom east of the Hydaspes River. Porus commanded a powerful army, including war elephants with castle-like hovdas on their back, carrying archers and javelin men. But before Alexander could meet him in battle, he first had to solve the problem on how to cross a rapid river in full view of the enemy. Once again, Alexander turned to the psychological field of warfare. For weeks, Alexander used his mounted forces to run up and down the western bank, making repeated feints and sudden movements, as if preparing to cross at different points. And each time, the Indian army was forced to follow his movements. And by doing this for weeks on end, Alexander was hoping to exhaust and psychologically wear down the Indians until an opening might reveal itself. Eventually, Porus started to call Alexander's constant bluffs, thinking he would never actually cross the river at all, which made him gradually let his guard down as the weeks went by. But then, during a night of violent storm and heavy rain, Alexander decided to make his move. Under the cover of darkness and a raging storm, Alexander, along with a contingent of 5,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, went 25 kilometers upstream, where an island in the middle of the river offered a natural concealment for a crossing. Using simple rafts, the Macedonians started to cross the river. Meanwhile, the rest of the army was left behind to make it look like the entire Macedonian army was still at the main camp. Alexander's men continued to cross the river in stages throughout the night, and by dawn, the bulk of the Macedonian army had successfully landed on the other side. They were now finally spotted, but before Porus could properly react, the Macedonians had already secured the eastern bank, which allowed most of the other half of the Macedonian army to start crossing the river as well. But a smaller detachment of the Macedonian army was at this point still kept back at the main camp, to confuse Porus even further, and to sell the lie of a non-crossing as much as possible. It was even reported that an Alexander look-alike with a similar horse and armor was still outside the royal tent. And because of this, Porus could not know to a certainty the scale of the river crossing, and thought it may just be another trick to get him to move his army up north, and thereby give Alexander an opportunity to cross at the main camp instead. But eventually, as more scout reports came in, as well as hearing news that his own son had been killed in battle at the crossing site, Porus finally moved his army north to confront Alexander, and proceeded to deploy his more than 100 war elephants in a long line at the front. Behind the elephants, he positioned his 40,000 infantry, with 4,000 cavalry covering the flanks. It was a clever formation by Porus. The elephants would break up the Macedonian line, allowing his infantry and cavalry to crush them in the chaos. Alexander, on the other hand, responded with the regular formation of his 40,000 phalanx in the center and his 7,000 cavalry split between the flanks. As the two armies were done positioning, Alexander noticed that the Indian left flank was weaker than the one on the right, and responded by deploying additional cavalry for a tougher strike on that side. The battle began with Alexander sending out his horse archers to harass the Indian cavalry, and when the Indians charged in pursuit, they were quickly met by Alexander's main cavalry force. This caused the Indian left flank to quickly crumble under the pressure, and, as Alexander predicted, Porus hastily moved his units from the right to aid the collapsing left. And this was exactly what Alexander was waiting for, who then responded by sending his reserve cavalry all the way around the center and attacked the Indian left flank from the rear. Porus sent a few of his war elephants to aid his crumbling cavalry force, but the Macedonians crushed them before the slower moving elephants could arrive. The central forces now advanced against each other, with the phalanx and the mighty war elephants going head to head. The phalanx, however, had been well trained to efficiently fight the elephants, and even though the elephants did a lot of damage, they also quickly panicked when the Macedonian spears and javelins started to hurt them. And before long, they fled in fear, trampling their own infantry in the process. And while things were already getting bad for the Indians, the battle was completely sealed when the rest of Alexander's army, which had crossed the river downstream, attacked them from behind. Porus was captured, and the remaining Indian infantry laid down their weapons. And thus, through deception and raw tactical brilliance, another king was brought to his knees. Thank you for watching. What is your favorite tactical move by Alexander, and which commander should I cover next? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the content, why not subscribe? See you again soon.